Wrangel Island sits alone in the Arctic Ocean, north of Siberia, where the Chukchi Sea meets the East Siberian Sea. It is a wide, treeless place, edged by gravel beaches and low cliffs, with ridges that rise inland and flatten again into open ground. In late summer the tundra can look almost gentle from a distance, colored by moss and lichen, but the softness is thin. Under it is permafrost, and above it the air moves with a steady, practical cold. For much of the year, sea ice defines the island more than land does. The coast is often locked behind pressure ridges and drifting floes. Wind carries salt and grit. Fog can settle without warning and erase the horizon until ocean and sky become a single pale surface. When the weather clears, the light can feel sharp, as if the sun is present but far away. The animals here follow older routes than any human plan. Polar bears patrol the shore and the ice edge. Arctic foxes move quickly across the open ground, appearing and disappearing with the contours. Seals surface in leads where the ice breaks. Birds gather where they can, brief and loud in the short season that allows it. Wrangel's isolation is not a romantic idea. It is geographic fact. It lies hundreds of miles from the nearest settlements, and the sea between is not dependable passage. In the early 20th century, reaching the island depended on weather, on ice, on ships that could endure both, and on timing that could not be forced. It is a place where supplies cannot be replaced easily, where mistakes accumulate, and where waiting is not passive. Even when nothing is visibly wrong, the environment is already shaping every decision. The island does not announce danger. It simply requires endurance from the start. Ada Blackjack was an Iñupiat woman from Alaska, born in 1898 near the settlement of Solomon on the Seward Peninsula. Her early life was marked by conditions common to many indigenous families in the region at the time: seasonal work, limited access to formal schooling, and the pressure of outside economic systems that had arrived quickly and unevenly. She spoke Iñupiat and learned English later, not as a cultural preference but as a necessity in a world that increasingly demanded it. In her late teens, Ada married a man named Jack Blackjack. The marriage did not bring stability. By the early 1920s she was largely on her own, raising their young son, Bennett. He suffered from tuberculosis, an illness that was widespread in Alaska in that era and difficult to treat, especially for families with little money. Ada's decisions in the years that followed were shaped by that single fact: her child needed care, and care required income. She worked when she could. Employment for Native women in Nome and surrounding communities often meant domestic labor, cooking, cleaning, sewing, tasks that were undervalued but steady when available. Ada was known to be a capable seamstress. She could mend clothing and repair gear, practical skills in a region where supplies were expensive and replacement was not guaranteed. By 1921, the prospect of earning a significant wage in a short time carried real weight. When an Arctic expedition was recruiting in Nome, Ada was not looking for adventure. She was looking for money. The job offered pay that could support medical treatment for Bennett and provide a kind of security she had not been able to build through local work alone. The expedition was presented as a small, controlled effort. Ada was hired primarily as a seamstress and cook. She was not recruited as a hunter or a navigator. Her experience with cold weather was real, but it was the experience of a person living in Alaska, not the specialized training of polar exploration. She would be traveling with men who described themselves as prepared, equipped, and capable. The decision to go north was not made in a vacuum. It came from a specific time and place. A woman in her early 20s, responsible for a sick child, offered a rare opportunity to earn a meaningful income. The risks were acknowledged in general terms, but the details were distant and abstract. Wrangel Island was not a familiar name in most lives. It was far beyond the routine boundaries of work and travel. Ada accepted the position. She left Alaska with the understanding that her role would be supportive, that the expedition had a plan, and that she would return with money for her son. The island, the ice, and the months ahead were still only concepts. The reality would come later, one day at a time. The expedition that brought Ada Blackjack to Wrangel Island was organized under a specific political idea, not a scientific one. In the early 1920s, the Canadian Arctic explorer Vilhjalmur Stephenson promoted the belief that Wrangel Island could be claimed for Canada. The island had been sighted and visited by various expeditions over the previous century, but it remained remote and contested in practical terms. Stephenson's plan relied on presence. If a small party could live there long enough, the argument went, the claim would become harder to ignore. The group assembled for the mission was small. 4 young men were selected to land and remain on the island: Alan Crawford, a Canadian, and 3 Americans, Lorne Knight, Fred Maurer, and Milton Gow. They were not all experienced polar travelers. Their confidence came partly from Stephenson's assurances and partly from the general culture of exploration that still framed the Arctic as a place where determination could substitute for infrastructure. Ada was the only woman. She was also the only indigenous member of the party. Her hiring was described in practical terms: she could sew and cook, and she would help maintain the camp. The expedition's success depended on routine work as much as on ambition, and Stephenson knew that food preparation and clothing repair were not minor details. In the Arctic, small failures become structural problems. The plan assumed that a relief ship would arrive with supplies and that the party would be supported over time. The island was to be occupied through the winter, with hunting supplementing stored rations. They carried equipment for shelter, fuel, and communication, but communication in that era was limited and unreliable. Radio equipment was not a guarantee of contact. Messages could be delayed, misunderstood, or never received. Stephenson's larger vision also included the idea that the Arctic could be lived in more easily than most people believed. He had long argued that, with the right methods, polar survival was not only possible but sustainable. The Wrangel Island plan was, in part, meant to prove that argument. But the expedition depended on timing and logistics that could not be controlled from a distance. The Arctic sea routes were seasonal, and sea ice did not follow schedules. A ship could be turned back by conditions that were invisible from shore. Supplies that seemed adequate in summer could become insufficient in winter. Even the act of landing was a negotiation with weather and ice. In September 1921, the party reached Wrangel Island by ship and went ashore with their gear. They were left with a camp to establish and a long season ahead. The men's goal was to remain until relieved, to maintain their presence, and to keep the occupation alive on paper and in fact. For Ada Blackjack, the plan was simpler. She was there to work, to endure the months, and to return home with money. The island was not a symbol to her. It was a job site at the edge of the map. The landing on Wrangel Island in 1921 was not the beginning of an emergency. It was the beginning of a routine that was meant to hold. The ship brought the party to shore while the season still allowed movement. Supplies were unloaded in stages: boxes of food, fuel, clothing, ammunition, tools. The men moved with the urgency of people who understood that the ship would not wait for comfort. Once the vessel left, there would be no quick return. The camp was established near the coast, where access to the sea ice and the shoreline could support hunting. The ground was uneven, a mixture of gravel and tundra. Shelter was basic. The structures they set up were designed for function, not permanence. Everything was arranged with winter in mind, but winter was still a distant presence, held back by the remaining light. At first, the group worked as a unit. Tasks were divided along familiar lines. The men handled hunting and heavy labor. Ada cooked, maintained clothing, and kept the interior of the shelter in order. Her work was quiet but constant. In an environment like this, meals were not just food. They were a schedule marker, a way to keep the day shaped. The first separation came not from conflict but from geography and necessity. Hunting required movement away from camp. Polar bears, seals, and birds were not evenly available. The men began making longer trips, sometimes out of sight, to locate animals and assess conditions. These journeys were part of the plan, but each departure introduced a small gap in the group's cohesion. The island's scale made distance feel larger than it was. With no trees and few landmarks, a person walking away could become a small shape quickly. Fog could reduce visibility to a few yards. Wind could erase tracks. The environment encouraged caution, but it also demanded effort. If they stayed still, supplies would shrink. If they moved, they risked disorientation. As the weeks passed, the party began to understand that they were not simply camping. They were committed. The sea between Wrangel Island and the mainland was already changing. Ice was forming more consistently. The ship's departure was no longer a temporary absence. It was the condition of their lives. The first real tension was subtle. It came from the awareness that help depended on forces outside their control. They were waiting for a future arrival that might not come on time. They continued working, hunting, and organizing, but the island was already setting the terms. The point of no return did not arrive with a single dramatic moment. It arrived as the season closed behind them. By the time winter began to settle over Wrangel Island, the camp had taken on the shape it would keep for months. The shelter was a center point, a place where heat and food could be managed, where clothing could be dried, and where small repairs could be made before they became failures. Outside, the island remained open and exposed. There were no forests to break the wind, no villages to move toward, no alternate route if the shoreline became impassable. Daily life became structured because it had to be. A routine reduced waste and prevented small problems from spreading. The men hunted when weather allowed, moving across the tundra and along the ice edge, watching for seals and other game. The work required patience and a careful reading of conditions. In the Arctic, energy spent without return is not simply tiring. It is dangerous. Inside the camp, Ada's responsibilities were constant. She prepared food from what they had and what the hunters brought in. She managed the use of supplies and helped maintain clothing, sewing tiers and reinforcing seams. In cold conditions, fabric failure is not cosmetic. A split glove or a worn boot can become a medical emergency. Her role was not ceremonial. It was part of the expedition's survival system. The rations were finite, and the group understood it early. They had brought preserved foods intended to last until the relief ship arrived. The plan depended on supplementation through hunting, but hunting could not be scheduled. Some days brought meat. Other days brought only effort. The stored food became a reserve that had to be guarded. Fuel was equally important. Heat depended on it. Cooking depended on it. A fire was not something to be enjoyed. It was something to be managed. The men used what they had with restraint, aware that running out would change everything. As the season darkened, the island's character shifted. Snow covered the ground more consistently. Wind sharpened. The ocean became less like open water and more like a surface of moving ice. The camp's perimeter began to feel smaller, not because the island had changed size, but because travel became harder. Distance demanded more time, and time demanded more calories. The psychological pressure of winter was not sudden. It accumulated in quiet ways. Days became repetitive. Tasks were done because they were necessary, not because they offered progress. There was no new information arriving from outside. The world had narrowed to a few people, a few structures, and a few miles of usable ground. Ada was living among men who were focused on a larger purpose. The expedition was meant to serve a political claim, and the men understood themselves as participants in that project. But winter has a way of reducing ideals to immediate needs. The daily question became simple: what can be done today that will make tomorrow possible? Illness and injury were always potential threats, and the cold made every physical weakness more significant. Frostbite could begin unnoticed. Exhaustion could lead to mistakes. A fall could become serious because recovery would be slow. The group monitored each other, but their resources were limited. They had basic medical supplies, but not the ability to treat major complications. Still, the camp held. Food was rationed. Meat from hunting added to their stores. Clothing was kept in repair. The shelter remained intact. The first winter weeks were difficult, but they did not yet resemble collapse. The party continued to act as if relief would arrive as planned, and in that assumption they found a reason to keep the routine strict. The island, however, did not respond to optimism. It offered no signal of what the coming months would bring. The only certainty was that the sea ice would control the schedule, and that the group's survival would depend on how well they could stretch what they had until the outside world returned. As winter deepened, hunting shifted from a supplement to a requirement. The stored rations could not carry 5 people indefinitely, and the hope of a relief ship could not be treated as a guarantee. The men began to range farther when conditions allowed, using the limited daylight and brief windows of calmer weather to search for seals along the ice and for birds or other animals inland. Wrangel Island offered food, but it did not offer it evenly. The sea ice could form solidly one week and fracture the next, opening leads that attracted seals but also creating hazards underfoot. Pressure ridges rose in broken walls where the ice had collided and folded. Moving across them required careful steps, and a misjudgment could mean a fall into freezing water or an injury that could not be properly treated. Polar bears were a constant presence. They were not a dramatic event so much as a fact of the landscape. Tracks appeared near camp. Shapes moved at the edge of visibility. The group carried rifles and kept watch, not because they expected an attack every day, but because they understood that a hungry bear could approach without warning. Even when no bear appeared, the possibilities shaped where they stored food and how they moved outside. Weather dictated the pace of work. Wind could pin them inside for long periods, and when it eased, the impulse was to use the opportunity fully. But overuse carried its own cost. Hunting trips demanded calories, and if the return was small, the balance turned against them. In an environment like this, effort had to be measured as carefully as food. The equipment they had brought was functional but limited. Clothing could be repaired, but not endlessly improved. Boots wore down. Gloves stiffened and cracked. Metal tools became brittle. Ammunition was not infinite. Even the simplest items, matches, lamp oil, needles, were counted, not assumed. Ada continued to hold the domestic center of the camp together. She cooked what could be cooked, sometimes stretching meals with whatever was available. She cleaned and organized, not for comfort, but to keep the shelter workable. Damp clothing needed attention. Bedding needed to be managed. Small repairs had to be done before they became permanent losses. Her sewing skills were a form of maintenance that extended the life of their gear. The men's work outside was shaped by uncertainty. Some hunts succeeded. Seals provided fat and meat that could be used efficiently. When a seal was taken, the return was not just food for the day but a temporary easing of pressure. Fat could be rendered for fuel. Meat could be stored in the cold. But success was never predictable, and failure was not always the hunter's fault. A calm day could still yield nothing if animals were elsewhere. The relief ship was expected to return with additional supplies, and the absence of that arrival began to change how the group spoke about time. At first, delay could be explained by ice conditions. Then it became harder to interpret. The men had no reliable way to know whether the ship had been turned back, damaged, or simply postponed. The island offered no communication that could resolve uncertainty. With each passing week, the limits of the original plan became clearer. The expedition had been designed around a schedule that assumed support from outside. Without that support, the party's margin narrowed. They could continue hunting and rationing, but they could not create new supplies from nothing. Every item they used moved them closer to depletion. The strain did not appear only in hunger. It appeared in fatigue, in slower movement, in the careful way decisions were made. It appeared in the way storms were watched, not with curiosity, but with calculation. A week of bad weather could undo a month of careful management. By the time the darkest part of winter settled in, the camp was still functioning, but the situation had changed in substance. They were no longer simply waiting for relief. They were living with the possibility that it might not come at all, and that their ability to endure would depend on how long the island continued to offer enough to keep them alive. The first signs of serious decline came through illness, not through a single accident. In polar conditions, health problems can grow quietly. A cough that would be manageable elsewhere can become dangerous when the body is already stressed by cold and limited food. Fatigue becomes normal, then becomes disabling. Small infections linger. Recovery slows. Among the group on Wrangel Island, Lorne Knight became the clearest example of that shift. His health deteriorated over time, and by early 1923 he was no longer able to contribute to the daily work. Accounts differ on the precise sequence of symptoms, but the outcome was consistent. He became increasingly weak, unable to travel, and dependent on the others for basic care. The camp had not been designed for long-term nursing. There were no medical facilities, no way to evacuate a sick person, and no certainty that help would arrive in time. The men were forced to adapt their survival plan to include a new responsibility, keeping one of their own alive while also keeping themselves fed. This changed the balance of labor. Hunting still had to be done, but it could not be done by everyone. Someone needed to stay near camp. Someone needed to watch for bears. Someone needed to maintain the shelter and the stove. Ada's role expanded, not because she chose it, but because she was the person most consistently present in the camp and most capable of managing the daily domestic work. She cooked and rationed with more pressure than before. She cleaned and kept the interior as stable as possible. She tended to clothing and bedding, which became more important as Knight's condition made him vulnerable to cold even inside the shelter. Her tasks were the same in name, but heavier in consequence. The group's survival was now tied to how well the camp could function with one member effectively removed from active work. The men continued to hunt, but their trips became more complicated. They were moving through deep winter conditions, and their returns had to cover not only their own needs but also the needs of someone who could not hunt for himself. When food was scarce, decisions about distribution became unavoidable. The group tried to maintain fairness, but fairness in a survival situation is often constrained by biology. A sick body needs calories. A working body needs them too. The psychological strain grew in ways that were difficult to measure. Isolation had already narrowed their world. Now the camp also carried the steady presence of illness. It changed the atmosphere inside the shelter. It forced attention onto the possibility of death, not as an abstract risk, but as a practical problem that might soon need to be managed. Outside, the island remained indifferent. The weather did not soften because someone was sick. The sea ice did not open to allow rescue. Polar bears continued to move along the coast. The work of survival continued, and it did not slow down to accommodate grief or exhaustion. Ada's position in the group became more exposed. She was the only person whose primary responsibilities were inside the camp, and she was the person most likely to be left behind if the others had to travel. Her dependence on the men for hunting and protection was real, but the men's dependence on her for camp function was equally real. Their survival system had become interlocked. As weeks passed, the possibility of leaving the island began to be discussed more seriously. The absence of a relief ship could no longer be explained as a short delay. The men had to consider whether they would attempt to reach help themselves, a decision that carried its own risk. Traveling over sea ice toward Siberia was not a straightforward route. It meant moving across unstable terrain with limited supplies, in conditions where navigation errors could be fatal. The group was approaching a stage where waiting was no longer neutral. Waiting was becoming a decision with consequences. But leaving meant abandoning the sick man, and possibly abandoning the camp itself. The problem was not only logistical. It was moral, and it was shaped by the harsh arithmetic of survival. By early 1923, their situation had narrowed to a set of options that were all dangerous. The island had not yet killed them, but it had reduced their margin to almost nothing. And in that reduction, the work of staying alive became less about routine and more about choosing what losses they could endure. In the spring of 1923, the party's situation reached a point where delay could no longer be treated as temporary. The relief ship that had been expected to return had not arrived. The stored supplies were diminished. Hunting continued, but it could not fully stabilize the future. The group had already survived one winter, and the prospect of being forced into another without outside support changed the nature of every decision. Lorne Knight's illness made those decisions sharper. He was no longer capable of travel. He could not be moved easily, and the group did not have the equipment or strength to carry him across ice for any meaningful distance. His condition meant that any attempt to seek help would require leaving him behind. The three remaining men who could still travel, Alan Crawford, Fred Maurer, and Milton Gow, made the decision to attempt a journey to the Siberian mainland. The plan was to cross the sea ice and reach help, then return with rescue and supplies. It was not an act of exploration. It was an act of necessity. They left in March 1923. The timing was chosen because the sea ice, though dangerous, could be traversable in late winter and early spring. But the route was long and uncertain. Distances in the Arctic are deceptive. A stretch of ice that appears stable can fracture under pressure or shift with wind. Leads can open without warning, turning a path into an impassable gap. Navigation is difficult when landmarks are minimal and weather can erase visibility. When the men departed, Ada remained behind with Lorne Knight. She was left with the camp, the remaining supplies, and the responsibility of maintaining shelter and food while also caring for someone who was seriously ill. The departure did not create a single dramatic moment. It created a quiet emptiness. The camp became smaller, not in physical size, but in capacity. Ada's survival now depended on work she had not originally been hired to do. Hunting became unavoidable. She had access to rifles and ammunition, but using them effectively required practice and composure. She began to hunt small game when possible and to make use of what she could find. She also had to stay alert for polar bears, which were now a direct threat to her alone. The days became narrower. With only 2 people in the shelter, and one of them largely incapacitated, routine was stripped down to essentials. Food preparation, fuel management, and basic sanitation continued, but every task took on greater weight because there was no labor to share and no margin for error. Knight's condition worsened over time. The historical record does not provide a complete medical account of what he suffered from, but his decline was steady. He became weaker, and his ability to eat and move diminished. Ada continued to care for him as long as she could, using what supplies remained and doing what was possible in a camp that had never been meant to function as a sick room. The men who left to seek help did not return. No confirmed trace of them was ever found. Their disappearance was one of the most severe outcomes of the expedition, and it left Ada alone in a way the original plan had never accounted for. Wrangel Island had become, in practical terms, a closed world. At some point after the others had gone, Knight died. The exact date is not known with certainty, and Ada's later accounts were shaped by memory and by the limits of documentation. What is clear is that she was eventually the only surviving member of the original party on the island. From that moment, survival was no longer a group effort. It was a solitary discipline. Ada maintained the camp as best she could. She kept watch, hunted when possible, and used the remaining supplies with restraint. Her actions were not framed by ambition or by political purpose. They were framed by the immediate requirements of staying alive on an Arctic island with no certainty that anyone was coming. By late summer 1923, the season had shifted again. The ice that had sealed Wrangel Island through winter began to loosen, breaking into floes and opening water along the coast. In the Arctic, this change does not guarantee access, but it creates the possibility of it. Ships can approach when they cannot in winter. Routes that were blocked begin to move. A vessel did eventually reach Wrangel Island. It was not the first ship that Stephenson's supporters had intended to send, and it did not arrive on the original schedule. But it came when the ice allowed it, and when the absence of contact could no longer be ignored. The expedition had been out of reach for nearly 2 years. When the rescuers landed and moved toward the camp, they found Ada alive. She had survived alone after the disappearance of the 3 men and the death of Lorne Knight. Her condition was not described as triumphant. It was described as real. She was thin, weathered by months of exposure and work, but capable of walking and speaking. She had kept herself alive through a combination of rationing, hunting, and maintaining the shelter. The camp itself reflected the long strain. Supplies had been used down. Clothing and equipment had been repaired repeatedly. Nothing was untouched by the environment. In a place like Wrangel Island, even stationary objects change over time. Fabric stiffens. Wood warps. Metal corrodes. The evidence of endurance is often physical, written into the condition of the tools. Ada was taken off the island and returned to Alaska. The journey back moved through the same geography that had made the expedition so vulnerable: ice, weather, and distance. But now the movement was toward inhabited places, toward ships that would continue past the edge of the map instead of leaving someone behind there. News of her survival spread quickly, and the story was taken up by newspapers and public interest. The expedition itself had been intended as a political statement, but it ended as a survival narrative defined by loss. 4 people had been left on the island with Ada. Only 1 came back. Ada's return did not erase what had happened. The 3 men who attempted the crossing remained missing. Lore Knight's death was confirmed only by her account and by the absence of any other outcome. The island kept its silence, offering no further record. For Ada, rescue meant the end of isolation, but it did not provide a clean conclusion. She had lived through months of responsibility that had not been part of her job description. She had endured a situation that the expedition's planners had not prevented. She returned alive, but the story that followed would be shaped by other people's interpretations as much as by the facts. The public story of Wrangel Island was shaped quickly after Ada Blackjack returned. Newspapers focused on the simplest elements: the remote Arctic setting, the missing men, the single survivor. In that framing, Ada became a symbol. Sometimes she was described as fortunate. Sometimes she was treated as an exception. The attention did not always match the reality of what had happened, or the reasons she had been there. The documented facts remained plain. The expedition had been organized with an expectation of resupply. That resupply failed. The island's conditions, combined with limited equipment and long delays, pushed the party into decisions that carried irreversible risk. 3 men disappeared attempting to cross the ice to Siberia. 1 man died in camp after illness. Ada lived. Her survival was not a mystery in the way it was sometimes presented. It came from a series of practical actions repeated over time. She stayed near shelter. She maintained equipment. She rationed food. She hunted when she had to, despite limited experience. She remained alert to polar bears and weather. None of these actions were dramatic by themselves. Together, they were the difference between a person who lasts and a person who does not. The expedition's failure also exposed something that was easy to overlook in early accounts. Ada had been hired for support work, but her work became central. Clothing repair, cooking, fuel management, and the basic order of camp life were not secondary tasks. They were the foundation that made hunting and travel possible. When the group began to break down, those domestic systems were what remained. After her return, Ada did not enter a life of exploration or public speaking. She went back to the practical concerns that had driven her decision to join the expedition in the first place. She had left to earn money for her son's medical care. Her survival did not remove that responsibility. It only added a new chapter to it, one that the outside world would interpret in ways she did not control. Wrangel Island itself did not change because of the expedition. It remained isolated. It remained difficult to reach. In later years it would be absorbed into larger political realities, but in 1923 it was still defined by distance and ice. The island's role in the story was not as an antagonist, but as a setting where plans could fail quietly and where human endurance could be tested without spectacle. Ada Blackjack's experience has endured because it sits at the intersection of ambition and necessity. The expedition's organizers pursued a territorial claim. The young men pursued a role in an Arctic project. Ada pursued wages for her child. The island treated those motives the same. It did not reward intent. It only measured preparation and persistence. When the story ends, there is no clean moral. There is only the record of what happened: a small party left on a remote island, a rescue that came late, and one person who remained alive long enough to be taken home. The rest is silence, the kind that exists in places where the environment does not explain itself.